All right, so we've got quite a bit to unpack here. You've brought in this fascinating collection of documents all about the Micro Works Macro ADC assembler. And it was specifically for the Radio Shack color computer.
Oh, yeah.
Which, when we think about old software, it's not just about the software itself, right?
Mm.
It's a glimpse into a time when programmers had to really think about squeezing every bit of performance out of limited hardware.
Absolutely.
So these sources you've brought in, they range from like really nitty-gritty stuff like I/O routines to memory maps, and they even touch on some of the future improvements that people were dreaming up for this tool.
Oh, that's always fun, like the what could have been.
Exactly. So I guess our mission, if you will, in this deep dive is to kind of extract the core of what made this assembler tick and why it might still be relevant or interesting to, folks today.
Right.
Or look at how it worked, what it could do, and yeah, even where its creators and users thought it could go.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so to kick things off, what were the origins of this Micro Works Macro ADC, and why was it such a big deal for the color computer scene?
Well, if we think about early personal computing, assemblers were really, they were crucial for getting the most out of the limited hardware they had back then.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular assembler, the Macro ADC, was actually a successor to another assembler called the SDS ADC.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting is both of these assemblers drew inspiration from Motorola's own RSM-09 assembler.
Okay.
And that one was specifically designed for the 68XX series of CPUs.
Gotcha.
So, that kind of lineage tells you something about the pedigree and the level of sophistication they were aiming for.
So this wasn't just like some hobbyist's, weekend project, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
This thing premiered in July of 1982 in Rainbow Magazine. And it quickly gained a reputation as the premier disk-based macro assembler for the color computer.
Now, that disk-based part, is that key here?
That's key.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of the earlier assemblers, were ROM-based, and those had some inherent limitations.
Yeah, like the EDT-ASM Plus cartridge that one of the articles mentioned.
Exactly.
What made the MicroWorks one so much better?
Well, several things. First, for $99.95, it offered features that were pretty advanced for the time.
Okay.
And these features weren't really available on the color computer platform before this.
Yeah.
We're talking about things like local labels, which help you organize your code better.
Okay.
Powerful macro capabilities, which let you, define your own instructions, essentially.
Ooh.
Conditional assembly, so you could have parts of your code that only got assembled under certain conditions.
Oh, that's neat.
And even compatibility with the older 6800 processors mnemonics.
Oh, wow.
Which made it easier for programmers who were familiar with that chip to kind of transition over.
I see. So it had that backwards compatibility built in.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, again, that it was disk-based. How did that change the game?
Well, being disk-based meant it wasn't confined by, the space limitations of those ROM cartridges.
Right.
So it could handle much larger source code files, potentially even spanning multiple disks.
Okay.
Which was a huge deal for, more ambitious projects.
Yeah.
And another thing, it came with its own editor that created plain ASCII text files.
Okay.
Which, get this, were compatible with Radio Shack BASIC.
Wow.
And the assembler itself didn't rely on line numbers, which was, a more modern approach at the time.
So this was it sounds like a pretty comprehensive package. For your $99.95, what all did you actually get?
Well, you got the assembler itself, obviously, the editor, a version of the assembler that was configured for printing listings,
Okay.
a help file, sample code to kind of get you started,
Nice.
and even a disassembler.
Oh, wow.
All on that 5.25 CRAS floppy disk. And apparently it came with a pretty good amount of documentation.
Really?
Yeah. So it was a full suite of tools for serious assembly language development on the color computer.
Okay. So we've established that it was a powerful tool, lots of impressive features for its time. But how did it actually work?
Right.
Like, what was going on under the hood when you actually ran the Micro Works Assembler?
This is where it gets really interesting because it was a classic two-pass assembler. So think of it like this. The first pass, which they actually called pass 1, but only after an initial pass 0 just to clear everything out.
Okay.
It would go through your source code and build these internal tables.
Right.
One for all the symbols or labels that you'd use, and another table for any macros that you had defined.
Gotcha.
So essentially it's taking inventory, noting down all the names you're using and what they refer to.
So it's like it's creating a dictionary before actually translating the language.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And then comes the second pass. Now, in the second pass, the assembler goes through your code again, but this time it has that dictionary.
Right.
And it uses the symbol and macro tables it built in the first pass to actually generate the machine code.
Okay.
Those raw instructions that the color computer's processor could understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it also generates any program listings that you've asked for,
Okay.
during the second pass.
I see. So how did the user actually interact with this two-pass process? Was it all automatic or?
Well, the sources tell us that there was a basic program that acted as kind of an interface.
Okay.
So you, as the user, would interact with this basic program and tell it which files you wanted to assemble, any output options you wanted, like if you wanted a binary file or a listing,
Right.
and any other kind of configurations. And then that basic program would take all that information and essentially hand it off to the machine language assembler to do its two-pass magic.
So BASIC was kind of like a front end for the real work being done in machine language.
Exactly.
Interesting. So even something, I guess, as seemingly fundamental as disk access that wasn't built into the assembler itself, right? It relied on the underlying operating system.
Precisely. And what's really clever is that the assembler itself was what they call position independent.
Okay.
This means it didn't care where in memory it was loaded.
I see.
So it relied on those built-in ROM routines of BASIC and disk BASIC for handling all the input and output operations and for managing files,
Okay.
which made it more flexible.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the actual assembly language itself.
Yeah.
What would you be writing? Was it just raw 6809 instructions or?
Well, you'd be writing mnemonics, which are those short, easy-to-remember codes that represent those 6809 instructions.
Right.
But the assembler also supported these things called assembler directives,
Okay.
which were essentially instructions for the assembler itself, not for the CPU.
Right.
So things like defining data or reserving memory or, controlling the assembly process.
Okay.
And as we mentioned earlier, it handled macro instructions.
Right. So one line in your source code could actually be replaced by a whole sequence of other instructions.
That's powerful.
Yeah. And it also let you use symbolic names, those labels we were talking about, to represent 16-bit values.
Mm-hmm.
And you could even perform math and logic operations on those symbols and numbers.
That sounds much more user-friendly than just dealing with raw hexadecimal opcodes.
Oh, yeah.
So to run all of this, to run this thing, what kind of system did you actually need?
Well, the bare minimum was any model of the color computer.
Okay.
But critically, you needed at least 32K of RAM and a disk drive.
32K.
And a disk drive. While it might have technically run on a 16K system, the sources really advise against it.
Okay.
It's too limited.
Yeah,
Unless, maybe it was somehow in ROM.
I see.
But that extra RAM in a 32K machine gave you more space for those all-important labels, macros, and the user stack.
So with a tight memory map like that on these machines, how much room did that typically leave for the actual program you're trying to write? That was always the balancing act, The assembler itself took up a significant chunk of that 32K. So you really had to be mindful of how much space your own code and data would need.
Mm-hmm.
Efficient coding and careful memory management. That was key.
What if you, being human, you made a mistake in your assembly code?
Right.
Was it a very forgiving system?
Error handling was definitely a part of the design.
Okay.
So the assembler would flag minor errors it encountered and try to keep going.
Okay.
But if it hit, a critical error that would prevent it from actually producing valid code,
Right.
it would abort the assembly and give you an error message.
Gotcha.
And you could also manually stop the process at any time by hitting the break key.
Okay.
As for the output, you had some options.
Mm-hmm.
You could get a binary file containing just the machine code,
Okay.
a listing file, which showed your source code alongside the generated machine code and any errors,
Okay.
or you could send that listing directly to a printer.
So it sounds like a fairly robust, development environment for its time.
Yeah.
Now, let's dig a little deeper into the specifics.
Sure.
The specific components and data structures that made this assembler work.
Okay.
The outline mentions I/O routines, memory organization, and how it handled labels and macros.
Right.
So let's start with those I/O routines.
Okay.
How did it, I guess, since it relied on the color computer's built-in system for interacting with the outside world,
Right.
How did it actually handle input and output?
Well, it needed a set of fundamental routines for tasks like outputting a byte of machine code,
Okay.
or printing error messages, or scanning the keyboard,
Right.
sending characters to output devices like the screen or a printer,
Right.
and getting characters back.
Okay.
And then it also had routines for basic line input, managing file buffers,
Okay.
something called an FCB or file control block,
Okay.
which is essentially a data structure used to manage file operations,
I see.
opening and closing files.
And even scanning the disk directory for file names.
Right.
There were also specific routines for checking the keyboard during assembly, waiting for a keystroke, printing assembly lines in hexadecimal strings,
Right.
and sending blocks of data to the output file.
Right.
And the sources even list specific memory addresses for some of these key routines.
Really?
Like, for example, 0EC3 for something called OPMCBY, which outputted a machine code byte.
So it sounds like even for these, really basic tasks like showing something on the screen or saving data, the assembler had this fundamental set of tools it relied upon
Right.
within the color computer system.
It was building on what was already there.
That's fascinating to see those specific memory addresses. It really highlights, how close to the metal, so to speak, programmers were working back then.
Absolutely.
Now, what about memory organization? How did the Micro Works Assembler manage the color computer's, pretty limited RAM?
Well, this was absolutely crucial.
Yeah. As the source material emphasizes, every byte mattered.
Right.
So the assembler was designed to make the most of a 32K color computer.
Okay.
A 16K system was really considered far too restrictive.
Well.
So when the assembler would start up the disk basic system, it would reserve a chunk of RAM.
Okay.
Specifically, 6 graphic screen pages, which amounted to over 9,000 bytes.
Okay.
And then the assembler itself would occupy a significant portion of the remaining RAM.
Right.
From addresses 0Es and dollars to 31FF.
Gotcha.
And this space wasn't just for the assembler's code. It also included areas for its own variables and even some unused reserved RAM.
Okay.
And the documentation, it even breaks down specific memory locations.
Really?
For things like the assembler's execution address, which was at 0Es and dollars, and that RAM hook we just talked about for sending bytes, that was at 0EC3.
Oh, yeah.
It also allocated space for things like the user stack. And then further up in memory, there were areas for the heap where it stored things like macros and label information.
So it sounds like a really carefully planned allocation.
Oh, yeah.
And then what about labels? Labels are pretty essential for writing understandable assembly code.
Right.
How did the Micro Works Assembler handle them?
They're absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
Because they act as those symbolic names that represent 16-bit memory addresses. So the assembler supported a few different types.
Okay.
There were standard labels, up to 6 characters long,
Right.
starting with a letter.
Okay.
Then you had general-purpose local labels, which were a single letter followed by the @ symbol.
Okay.
And within macros, you could have macro local labels, which started with @
Gotcha.
And there was even a special label called an ARD that you could use inside a macro to get the number of arguments that were passed to it.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah.
So internally, how are these labels stored?
They were stored in a sorted array, with each label occupying an 8-byte record,
Right.
or 10 bytes if cross-referencing was enabled. Now, this record, it held the 16-bit value of the label and its identifier.
Right.
The fact that it was this fixed-size sorted array allowed for pretty efficient lookups.
Okay.
The assembler also kept track of the status of each label, whether it was defined in the first pass, the second pass, or through a set directive.
Right.
And for cross-referencing, it used linked lists to keep track of all the places where a particular label was used in the code.
So linked lists for cross-referencing. That's a clever way to manage all that information.
Yeah.
And you mentioned macros earlier. How were those stored?
Well, macros were also stored in the heap, using another linked list.
Okay.
Each macro was essentially stored as a record of plain text, exactly as it appeared in your assembly source code.
Right.
And each record in this linked list would contain a pointer to the next macro in the list,
Right.
the name of the macro, and then the text that made up the macro itself.
Right.
And then, obviously, the last macro in the list would have a null pointer to signify the end.
So it's like the assembler was building its own little database of these reusable code snippets.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about managing all the different input sources? The outline mentions these input file descriptors. What were those all about?
Oh, this is an interesting concept that they used.
Yeah.
Think of it as a way for the assembler to keep track of where it was currently reading assembly code from.
Okay.
So there were four main types of input sources.
Okay.
The primary one, of course, was the root disk file.
Right.
That's the main assembly file that you started with.
Gotcha.
But you could also have include files, which were separate files that you could insert into your main code using a directive.
Okay.
And then there were the macros themselves, which, when invoked, would become a temporary source of input.
Right.
And finally, you had the macro parameters. Those are the values that you pass to a macro when you use it.
Okay.
So the assembler used a stack of these input file descriptors to manage all of these different sources.
Yeah.
So when it opened a new source, it would push a new descriptor onto the stack and keep track of things like the file number for disk files or a pointer to the text for macros.
Okay.
And then when it was done with that source, it would pop that descriptor off the stack and go back to the previous one.
That makes sense. It's like, keeping your place in multiple books at once.
Exactly.
Now, the last data structure you mentioned was mnemonics.
Right.
How are those organized for, quick lookups?
Well, mnemonics, pseudocodes, and those code substitutions we talked about earlier,
Right.
they were all stored in a tree data structure.
Okay.
And this tree was designed for really fast lookups.
Right.
So the first step in evaluating a mnemonic was to strip off any leading L characters.
Okay.
Now, this was apparently done as a space-saving measure in the mnemonic table
I see.
because L was a common prefix.
Yeah.
Then the assembler would use the first letter of the potentially stripped mnemonic
Right.
to branch into the tree, which was essentially an alpha-sorted list of mnemonic records.
Okay.
And these records contained all the information the assembler needed, like the actual opcode,
Right.
which registers were involved, whether a prebyte was needed, and even a pointer to a code substitution if one existed.
Gotcha.
And the matching process, it wasn't just a simple character-by-character comparison.
Okay.
It also took into account things like implicit or explicit register use
I see.
and the logic for conditional assembly.
Okay.
And if a mnemonic wasn't found in the tree,
Yeah.
the assembler would then search for a matching macro
Okay.
before finally reporting an error.
So the multi-stage lookup process,
Exactly.
prioritizing those built-in instructions before even looking at user-defined macros.
Yep.
Sounds like a very efficient design.
It was.
Now let's move on to the math and logic package.
Okay.
You've mentioned before that a good assembler needs this to be really flexible.
Right.
So what did the MicroWorks offer in this area?
Well, you're absolutely right. Even though the core job of an assembler is translating text to machine code,
Right.
being able to manipulate data and symbols, it's crucial.
Yeah.
And so the MicroWorks assembler had a dedicated math and logic package that provided, a central point for all these needed functions.
Okay.
It allowed you to work with expressions,
Yeah.
which could be single elements, functions, or even combinations of both.
Gotcha.
And the assembler had a specific routine.
Okay.
It was called EVALXP
EVLXP.
at memory address 27C8.
27C8.
Gotcha.
And that was responsible for evaluating these expressions.
Okay. And so what kind of inputs and outputs did this evaluation routine have?
Well, as input, it would take a pointer to the expression and a relative offset.
Right.
And then the outputs, they included an error code,
Okay.
which was stored in the B register of the accumulator,
Gotcha.
indicating things like an undefined expression or a forward reference.
Mm-hmm.
And then the result of the evaluation would be stored in the X index register.
Now, what's interesting is that it actually created a temporary data structure on the user stack during this evaluation process
Right.
to keep track of things like return addresses, stack values, the program counter or the effective address, and any kind of error status. So it was using the stack as temporary workspace.
Interesting. So how did it handle, more complex expressions with multiple operations?
Well, it supported both chained and linked operations.
Okay.
So chained operations were for addition and subtraction.
Right.
And those were handled by routines called EVEXPR, addOPR, and subOPR.
Okay.
And then linked operations were for other math and logic functions.
Okay.
Like multiplication, division, logical A&D, or XOR.
Okay.
And even shifts and rotates and exponentiation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And these were triggered by specific symbols in the expression.
Right.
So like, for example, for multiplication, or $80 plus 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 $80 for logical A&E.
Nice.
So once all that evaluation and linking and chaining were done, The final result would be returned in the D register,
Okay.
which is the combined A and B accumulators,
Oh, yeah.
as a 16-bit value.
Yep.
And then that would often be transferred to a X register for further use.
Gotcha. What kind of elements could you actually use in these expressions?
Well, the elements were those basic data units, and they could be symbolic.
Yeah.
Those flagged with characters like the single quote or the